You're listening to episode number 15 of Overprescribed. Welcome to Overprescribed, the show that raises America's awareness on pharmaceutical medications in this country, all in an effort to help you, the everyday consumer, to live the safest, healthiest, and most informed medication experience possible. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Overprescribed. I was doing some reading recently and I came across something that caught my eye related to a drug called febuxostat. That's febuxostat. And just in case you're not familiar with the drug febuxostat, which also goes by the brand name Uloric, this is a drug indicated for the treatment of chronic management of hyperuricemia in patients with gout. And according to WebMD, gout is a kind of arthritis caused by a buildup of uric acid crystals in the joints. So normally uric acid is formed in our bodies as the body breaks down purines, which are chemical compounds that may typically be found in some foods and some drinks. And then it's broken down or processed by our kidneys and eliminated in urine. But in some people who have an accumulation of this uric acid, they may develop gout. According to the Arthritis Foundation, gout appears to come on suddenly, often in the form of a painfully swollen big toe or lower body joint. In reality, it's the end result of a process that's been taking place in the body for a while. The foundation goes on to state that lifestyle factors such as a high diet or diet high in certain high purine foods, obesity, and excessive alcohol use, especially heavy beer consumption, also can contribute to the development of hyperuricemia and gout. So this gout drug, febuxostat, is basically being petitioned to be pulled off the market by a nonprofit consumer advocacy group called Public Citizen. Now, Public Citizen has been around since the 1970s, and they are self-proclaimed champions of public interest. Their slogan is protecting health, safety, and democracy, and they have been responsible for contributing to 23 drugs being pulled off the market in their history and in getting black box and other warnings added to drug labeling. With regards to febuxostat, Public Citizen made a very detailed and what seems to be a strongly substantiated petition to the FDA recently urging for the immediate removal of febuxostat from the U.S. market. And I want to read the full press release to you directly from Public Citizen's website. Okay, it's dated June 21st of 2018, so literally within the last month, this was submitted. The title is FDA Should Pull Twice Rejected Gout Medication Off the Market. Agency has overwhelming evidence that medication increases risk of death. Okay, and it states the following. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, should immediately remove from the market the widely used medication febuxostat because it poses unique, serious risk, some fatal, for no unique benefit, Public Citizen said today in a citizen petition to the agency. There is overwhelming evidence that the serious cardiovascular harms of febuxostat outweigh any purported clinical benefit, the petition states. Leaving it on the market ensures further preventable harm to patients. Febuxostat is sold by Takeda Pharmaceuticals America under the brand name medication Uloric. Initial clinical trials testing febuxostat prior to FDA approval linked the medication to possible increased risk of serious adverse cardiovascular outcomes, including heart attack and stroke and death. The FDA rejected the medication twice over these safety concerns before approving it in 2009 on the condition that the manufacturer conduct a large post-market randomized clinical trial to further evaluate the cardiovascular risk. In the decade since, the medication has been aggressively marketed and prescribed to at least hundreds of thousands of patients who were unaware of the potential dangers, Public Citizen's petition states. Takeda reported $1.9 billion in U.S. sales of febuxostat from fiscal years 2012 through 2017. For the one-year period ending in June 2015, there were 1.3 million U.S. prescriptions for Uloric, making it the 46th most prescribed brand name medication in the U.S. at the time. Before the FDA approved febuxostat, there was troubling evidence strongly suggesting that the medication increased the risk of serious adverse cardiovascular events and death, and the agency should have demanded that an appropriately designed clinical trial to assess febuxostat's cardiovascular risk be conducted before, not after approval, said Dr. Michael Carome, Director of Public Citizens Health Research Group. The results of the FDA-mandated post-market trial now provide additional high-quality evidence of a causal link between treatment with febuxostat and an increased risk of death, particularly death from cardiovascular causes. Results of the FDA-mandated post-market clinical trial finally were published in the New England Journal of Medicine on March 12, 2018. The study enrolled more than 6,000 gout patients who had a history of major cardiovascular disease. The subjects were randomly assigned to receive either febuxostat or the much older gout medication allopurinol. And the trial demonstrated that after 32 months, subjects receiving febuxostat were significantly more likely to die from any cause and from cardiovascular causes. Importantly, there also is no evidence from this post-market trial or any prior trials that febuxostat is more effective than allopurinol in preventing acute gout attacks or other clinically important complications of gout, the most crucial reasons for using such treatments. The FDA almost certainly would have denied approval of febuxostat if data from this post-market trial had been available at the time of the initial submission. The only justifiable course of action to prevent further cardiovascular deaths is obvious. This medication must be removed from the U.S. market immediately, Carome said. And that's the end of the press release. I think that what I've seen so far in terms of any response to this has only amounted to the FDA acknowledging receipt of the petition or acceptance of the petition in writing directly to Public Citizen. I have not seen a lot of conversation about this, at least on the social media channels that I've been on. But in looking at the very, very detailed petition, again, it's a 23-page petition that Public Citizen drafted and submitted to the FDA. There's some information in there that I found striking. And again, at least in my opinion, substantiated the request by Public Citizen to request the removal or the withdrawal of febuxostat from the market. So for one, again, the drug was rejected not once through a new drug application, but twice. And it was approved on the third try. According to some of the details of the petition, there was a trial called the FACT trial, and this is an acronym. The FACT trial, results on that was published in 2005. It was the first phase 3 trial that included 507 febuxostat exposed subjects, which included 4 deaths out of the 507. And then the allopurinol group was a total of 253 subjects for 0 deaths. Then there was a second phase 3 trial that was published with results in 2008 called the APEX trial. Unlike the first phase 3, this time they added a placebo group. So 3 arms to this one, febuxostat, allopurinol, and placebo group. There were 0 deaths in that particular trial, but there was a greater proportion and more frequency when it came to serious adverse events in the febuxostat subject group. Even though this was all determined to not be statistically significant or, I guess, relevant based on the statistical design of the study. And there was also 2 long-term trials mentioned in this petition as well. Those long-term trials were ongoing when the new drug application was first submitted after the first phase 3 trial. And I think overall that, at least I saw the petition, that at some point 8 deaths were attributed to the long-term extension or result of the long-term extension trials in that study. And it looks like the first NDA submission, again, this is the new drug application from the drug company, was submitted and it was not approved as of October 2005. The FDA expressed significant concern regarding the excess serious adverse events in the febuxostat group. The second NDA submission, the second time the pharmaceutical company attempted to get this drug approved, was around February of 2006. The drug manufacturer brought in an expert reviewer to adjudicate over 100 serious cardiovascular events from prior trial studies. And despite that effort, it was still not approved by the FDA. The FDA still had concerns, and the no approval was issued in August of 2006. From page 10 of the petition to the FDA on febuxostat, it reads, the FDA concluded that the cardiovascular safety data for febuxostat remained a significant concern and required further study prior to reconsideration of whether to approve the drug. For example, one of the primary clinical reviewers opposed approval, offering the following overall assessment. This reviewer recommends non-approval action for febuxostat 80 milligrams and 120 milligram tablets for the treatment of hyperuricemia in patients with gout based on an unfavorable risk-benefit profile. Initial review cycle raised concerns regarding the potential for febuxostat 80 milligram and 120 milligram doses to cause cardiovascular or CV thrombotic adverse events in excess of that seen with allopurinol or placebo. Reanalyses of existing data and additional analyses of new data did not eliminate safety concerns raised in initial review. A further concern, the efficacy of febuxostat 80 milligrams and 120 milligrams was established based on a surrogate endpoint without sufficient evidence of clinical efficacy. The petition goes on to state on page 14, multiple FDA reviewers noted that questions and uncertainty remained about the cardiovascular safety of febuxostat based on the available data from the pre-market clinical trials. The FDA's Arthritis Advisory Committee met on November 24th, 2008 to discuss the NDA for febuxostat and voted 12-0 with 1 abstention to recommend FDA approval of the drug with a requirement for post-market studies to further assess the drug safety. On February 13th of 2009, the FDA issued an approval letter to Takeda Pharmaceuticals North America for the use of febuxostat for the chronic management of hyperuricemia in patients with gout. The petition goes on to read that the FDA stipulated that the trial, talking about the post-marketing trial, should start by January 31st of 2010 and be completed by January 31st of 2014, with a final report to be submitted to the FDA by January 31st, 2015. Notably, approval of febuxostat might not have occurred without the ability of the FDA to mandate post-marketing clinical trials under the authority of Title 9, Subtitle A, Section 901 of the Food and Drug Administration Amendment Acts of 2007, or the FDAAA. A provision that took effect in March 2008. Indeed, in his summary review, and I'm reading from page 15, by the way. Indeed, in his summary review, the director of the FDA's Office of Drug Evaluation 2 stated that, quote, had he not had the new authorities given under the FDAAA, which gives me some confidence that we can dictate a study such that we can get a definitive answer, my conclusion on whether to approve or not may have been different, end quote. Likewise, because of concerns about cardiovascular safety, some members of the Arthritis Advisory Committee, quote, "we're only willing to recommend approval due to the recent passage of FDAAA, which provides the agency with regulatory authority to require studies and implement strict timelines for completion," end quote. The initial FDA-approved labeling for febuxostat included the following in the warnings and precautions section. In the randomized control studies, there was a higher rate of cardiovascular thromboembolic events, or cardiovascular deaths, non-fatal myocardial infarctions, and non-fatal strokes in patients treated with febuxostat than allopurinol. A causal relationship with febuxostat has not been established. Monitor for signs and symptoms of myocardial infarction and stroke. Now, the petition doesn't say this, and I don't have any evidence of what the actual initial labeling said, but I don't read or I haven't seen any confirmation of any information in the labeling at the time of the approval or after the approval of febuxostat to be marketed and sold in the U.S., where it was provided to U.S. consumers that this particular drug had been, rejected or not approved, FDA approved based on certain concerns, not once, but twice prior to that third NDA submission by the drug manufacturer. Now, on page 15, it gets a little bit more interesting, and this is where things kind of crank up to the modern day in terms of where we are now with the state of febuxostat in public citizens, urgency of withdrawal of this drug from the market immediately. It looks like on page 15, under the section Strong Confirmatory Evidence of Harm from febuxostat, Public Citizen points out in their petition that on November 15, 2017, the FDA issued a drug safety communication alerting the public that preliminary results from the FDA-mandated post-market randomized controlled trial to assess the safety of febuxostat showed an increased risk of cardiovascular-related death and all-cause death with febuxostat compared with allopurinol. So it looks like the FDA was giving the public a heads up that, hey, based on the mandated post-marketing study, as terms and conditions from the drug approval that was issued for febuxostat, the initial drug approval in 2009, it looks like this is what we are seeing in terms of safety concerns. So that was in November 2017. Fast forward to March 12th of 2018, results of the post-market clinical trial were published in the New England Journal of Medicine Online, which demonstrated non-inferiority in terms of the primary composite cardiovascular outcomes endpoint, but higher all-cause and cardiovascular mortality in febuxostat-exposed subjects than in allopurinol-exposed subjects. So basically stating that for those who did receive febuxostat, they seem to have higher all-cause and cardiovascular mortality versus those who had been treated with allopurinol, the drug that had been on the market previously before febuxostat. Actually, had been on the market since I think the 60s as another treatment that had been used in these types of patients. I assume with fair success. The Public Citizen petition then points out right to you on page 18 in clear black and white 3 graphical representations showing you primary endpoint, cardiovascular mortality, and all-cause mortality comparisons over the length of time of treatment for the febuxostat and allopurinol groups, which clearly shows a slight difference, or a difference, if you will, in febuxostat versus allopurinol impacting subjects, again, mortality, all-cause mortality, as well as cardiovascular mortality, as well as the endpoint. And this is from the CARES trial, which stands for Cardiovascular Safety of Febuxostat and Allopurinol in Patients with Gout and Cardiovascular Mortality. It was a double-blind, randomized, multi-center trial comparing once-daily febuxostat with once-daily allopurinol. And the petition goes on further to state that, in their opinion, the CARES trial provides strong evidence confirming the earlier concerns that treatment with febuxostat carried an excess risk of fatal cardiovascular events. The petition also points out that there was a recent published retrospective cohort study that was published in June of 2018, and this is on page 19 of the petition. According to this statement here in the petition, this particular trial that was published. It was a retrospective cohort study that used U.S. Medicare claims data from 2008 to 2013 to compare cardiovascular outcomes in gout patients age 65 or older who initiated treatment with febuxostat versus allopurinol. According to the petition, this retrospective cohort study had numerous major methodologic limitations, including its retrospective non-randomized study design, lack of enrichment for patients with a history of cardiovascular disease, lack of assessment of actual use of the prescribed study medications by the patients, short mean duration of follow-up, and an inability to assess cardiovascular or other cause-specific mortality. They further concluded again that the prior randomized controlled clinical trials, particularly the CARES trial, provide the most important evidence establishing febuxostat's unsafe cardiovascular profile, which really is underlining the entire purpose and the entire strength of the petition. In the petition, under the section on page 20, labeled Lack of Clear Meaningful Clinical Benefit with febuxostat over Other Gout Therapy, I found it very interesting once you read through that and got over to page 21, where it states that notably in all of the pre-market phase 3 trials that showed non-inferiority or superiority of febuxostat in lowering uric acid levels, allopurinol was consistently underdosed as described in the trial protocols. According to the petition, this added what the researchers considered to be a bias efficacy results in favor of febuxostat. Consistent with this trend, the phase 4 CARES trial that titrated both allopurinol and febuxostat to target SUA levels showed relatively small differences in the SUA lowering effects of febuxostat and allopurinol. So they're getting into a little bit more of the clinical details behind some of these trials. I didn't cover that in this episode. That's all in the petition if you're interested in reading about it. But I thought that was interesting too, that there was an underdosing of allopurinol, the drug that had been on the market for some time prior to febuxostat's entrance into the U.S. market. The researchers or the petition writers from a Public Citizen end their petition by stating that, importantly, FDA reviewers specifically noted that the interpretation of febuxostat's cardiovascular harms should be tempered by its modest surrogate benefits. They went on to conclude that the results of the FDA-mandated post-market trial now provide additional high-quality evidence of a causal link between treatment with febuxostat and increased risk of all-cause death and cardiovascular death. The FDA almost certainly would have denied approval of febuxostat if data from this post-market trial had been available at the time of the initial NDA submission, and the appropriate course of action now is obvious. We therefore request that the FDA remove from the market all medications containing febuxostat. And that's the end of this 23-page petition. Again, I will include a link to it in the show notes. It's robust, it's detailed. There's substantial information or evidence to support the request from Public Citizen to withdraw febuxostat from the market. And I look forward to finding out how this all shakes out.